interview with B.F. Skinner, a program from the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. B.F. Skinner, a Harvard professor, is a man of many accomplishments. Acknowledged America's leading exponent of behavioral psychology, he is also the author of the utopian novel Walden 2. He invented a mechanism for observing animal behavior called the Skinner box, and the air crib, a mechanical baby tender. He invented a teaching machine. He likes to listen to music and play the piano. Currently, he is also surprised and dismayed to find himself the object of a remarkably heated controversy. Dr. Skinner stirred up this controversy with his best-selling book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. His book described what he calls operant conditioning and its implications for human life. The implications frighten some readers, but others share his hope that operant conditioning will radically improve the quality of our lives. The Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions held a conference to discuss with Dr. Skinner both his theories and their implications. During a break in the proceedings, Center Fellow Harvey Wheeler, who organized the conference, talked with Dr. Skinner about operant conditioning. Mr. Wheeler recognized that Dr. Skinner's specialized terminology makes it difficult to fully understand his theories. He therefore started his interview with questions aimed at clarifying this terminology. He is just asked about the difference between operant conditioning and other approaches that depend on stimulus and response. He gives the carrot and the stick as an example of stimulus, but Dr. Skinner demurs.
The carrot and the stick can be confusing because if you are using the carrot or the stick to make a balky horse go forward, for example, what do? Well, with the stick, you beat the horse until it goes forward. That is operant conditioning with a negative reinforcer. It's escape. The horse goes to escape a beating. And when you crack the whip without touching the horse, and the horse then speeds up, you're using a conditioned negative reinforcer, and by speeding up, the horse avoids the whip on its flank by escaping from the crack of the whip. And when it speeds up, you stop cracking the whip. When it slows down, you start cracking the whip, and it speeds up. If you snap the whip, the effect on the horse is that of a stimulus which has in the past been correlated with an aversive condition. And by going fast, the horse can stop that. He can free himself from the threat of something. Now with the carrot, if you hold the carrot a few inches away from the horse's head and keep it going ahead, or if you have it on a stick fastened to the horse's neck so he never reaches it, you're taking advantage of something which has happened in the past history of the horse. So the carrot is a kind of discriminative stimulus also, you see. In a sense, the carrot and the stick are closer to the operant pattern than they are to the reflex pattern. But they're not clear-cut examples of...
Well, in any case, what we want to do is to make the distinction.
Harvey Wheeler is the speaker.
And when we're talking about the operant pattern, we're talking about the idea of a reinforcement.
That's right.
And not the idea of a stimulus.
Yes, although stimuli are brought into the picture when they are part of the contingencies.
Yeah. And the idea of the reinforcement is something that follows behavior.
In a given setting.
In a given setting. That's the important thing, the third term.
Yes.
That has the tendency to increase the probability that the specific behavior will occur in the future.
Yes, that's right.
And so we're talking about a reward system that follows behavior in a given setting, and the increase the probability of the response, and that reward can be either positive or negative.
That's right.
It can be in the form of food or some other thing that is a good in itself to the organism, or it can be in the form of the removal of something that is unpleasant to the organism.
It can be called good and bad. These are our own ways of describing events according to these effects on us.
These are things that follow the behavior in that setting and increase the probability, and it can be either the withdrawal of something that is unpleasant, in return for that behavior, or the adding of something that is pleasant. These are positive reinforcements and negative reinforcements. They're reinforcements because they increase the probability of the behavior.
Right. Yes.
Older ideas tend to confuse us when we're thinking about these things. How do we make it clear that when we're talking about a negative reinforcement, we're not talking about punishment?
Punishment would be defined as the reversal of these contingencies. If giving food to a hungry organism is reinforcing, then removing food from the presence of a hungry organism and forcing it to stop eating would be a punishment. And you could do this if you chose some other response the organism is engaging in, and if every time the organism does that you remove food or a stimulus which in the past has preceded food, then you would be punishing that particular response.
Let's take a simple example, and this is the example of the hot stove.
Yes.
And you want to teach the child that hot stoves burn.
Yes.
So you take a controlled experiment in the situation.
Yes.
And you make a very, very minor little demonstration to the child that if it touches a hot stove, it's going to get burnt.
Yes.
Now that's a punishment.
That is, because you're trying now to suppress behavior rather than produce it.
You want to suppress behavior,
Yes.
right. Now,
so producing a negative reinforcer or removing a positive reinforcer are the kinds of things which are called punishments.
now the question that I have in mind is whether or not operant conditioning works better with regard to an aim that is positive performance than it does with regard to an aim that is directed toward avoidance.
Well, that is an interesting question. I would suppose that punishment is part of the operant picture, at least it's part of the contingency picture. And I wouldn't call it reinforcement, but it is certainly the kind of thing which an operant laboratory is dealing with all the time. I think the issue here has to do with what is the effect of punishment. Normal belief is that it reverses rewards. If you have reinforced a rat for pressing a lever by giving it food, and then you punish it when it presses the lever, it comes back to nothing. It's back where it was in the first place. Well, that's not true. You can show that if you remove the punitive sanctions, the behavior will come back. But something has happened, definitely, that has reduced the tendency to press that lever. And what you look for then is the possibility that there has been reinforcement of incompatible behavior. If you have been punished by touching a hot stove, let's say that the stove is the kind of thing you do tend to touch. You've got to have the behavior there to begin with.
Well, children touch everything.
Yes, exactly. That's part of the phylogenic equipment they come with. You reach out and you're burned. Now, what has happened? Are you any less likely to explore things in the world? I think not. But when you come in the presence of this hot stove again, there is a condition built up through conditioning which is aversive. And by turning away from the stove, you can reduce that aversive stimulus. So turning away from the stove is an operant reinforced by the reduction of a conditioned aversive stimulus. And that you can also get that if you are a humane person who doesn't want a kid to get burned, you can slap him or warn him or use some lesser punishments.
That's a second degree
yes.
performance, however, because actually all you're teaching the child is that he doesn't want to get slapped. You're not necessarily teaching that stoves burn.
Right. But you're teaching him that there are other things which he can do.
This is like arresting a man for speeding.
Which will reduce the conditioned aversive effects of a hot stove. And
this is like arresting a man for speeding. Your argument there is that what you're teaching in this situation is not that he should not speed, but rather that he shouldn't get arrested.
That's right, but the Humane Society arranges things so that you aren't exposed to the natural consequences of driving fast, but to synthetic ones which have been arranged by society to build behavior which enables you to avoid.
But you cannot use, strictly speaking, positive reinforcement that is designed to produce performance very efficiently to produce avoidance?
Well, this is the whole question of the design of a culture, I think. Should we only use forms of punishment to suppress the behaviors which are dangerous to the individual and to others, or can we design a world in which they will never occur? Supposing you like objects of art and you have a low coffee table and you have a little breakable object on that. And then you bring a 2-year-old child into that room. Well, this is absurd, of course, because this little object has been designed to be attractive. That's the whole point of it. So the child reaches for this, and then you slap him. Well, rather than suppress that behavior in a small child, I would say take the object away before you get into the room. Let's change the environment in such a way that there is less behavior, less behavior will occur which has to be punished.
Well, now that means a fairly austere culture, then, if you're talking about a culture on this basis.
I'm not sure, Harvey. Take, for example, the whole question of delinquency in bad neighborhoods and so on. Now, if you say, oh, we need more law and order, we've got to teach these young people that they can't steal, and, well, we only get a bigger police force and so on. Or you might introduce educational programs into schools that stealing is bad, and religion might come in and say, thou shalt not steal, and this is some kind of a sin or something like that. But why not find out why kids steal? They can't get jobs and buy what they need. They don't have much of their own and so on. Now, the humane solution seems to me, rather than to continue to let people go all their lives with nothing and then punish them when they steal, find out some sort of a system whereby they can get things in a mode that is not punished.
Well, for a society to operate according to operant conditioning principles, then the society would have to be relatively equalitarian.
I'm not sure of that either. There's no doubt in my mind at all that one of the great steps we've got to take is to reduce the affluence of affluent society. I used to think that our role in the world was to bring everybody up to our level. But when you stop to think of 1 billion Chinese driving, what, 500 million motor cars over millions of miles of superhighways all over China, burn up the supplies in the world once and pollute the environment forever. We're not going to build a world like that. There's no question about that. And I think one of the great things we need is to redesign our life so that you can have a fine quality of life without this fantastic consumption.
Let's get back to this question of what you do about variable rates of enjoyment of the goods of life, yes, and without providing an equalitarian
well, when you said equalitarian, I thought at once of the kinds of arguments that Jensen is going to bring up. And
Jensen, the psychologist who is working on genetics,
yes, right,
and believes that there are genetic differences
which must be taken into account. And I do too. There's no doubt in my mind, quite apart from any ethnic implications. The gene pool is such that some people come up with a lot of highly useful skills and others don't. That bell-shaped curve, which turns up when you apply tests of intelligence or any other skill, is real. There's no doubt in my mind of that. Where a race comes into that is another matter. But let's just take it as it stands apart from that. Supposing the races all get mixed up so that as far as skin color goes and the facial features and so on, there's no difference. There would still be this enormous spread. Now, what do you do about it? Well, obviously, you cannot design an environment in which the less intelligent, if we can use that expression, end of this curve is going to do the kinds of things that people in the upper end do. They're not going to enjoy the same kinds of art, music, and so on. They're not going to engage in the same kinds of conversation or the same kinds of sports or games and all of that.
But they're going to want to.
That is the problem. You see, if the culture has taught them that they should, then you're going to have a hell of a lot of very unhappy people. This is the tragedy of the child of low IQ in a family of relatively high IQ. This child is forced to do things he's not able to do.
And forced to want to do things that he's not able to do.
Yes, things are expected of him. He's reinforced for doing any little thing in that direction. There's always something up against failure of one kind or another. That's a tragedy, and it would be a greater one if the world expected these people down here to be able to engage in conversation on advanced topics with the people at the other end.
Now, this is exactly the problem that Plato confronts in the Republic, isn't it?
Yes.
As he comes to the conclusion that you've come to, namely that there are qualitative differences among people, and that some people are only fit for certain tasks in society.
Well, that being fit for a task is making it a little rough, I think. Of course, that is correct. But that doesn't mean you then make slaves of them or anything of that sort.
No, but there's a range of behavior that they can perform, and there's another range of behavior that they can't perform. And the problem that Plato tries to confront in the Republic is how to see that they do this behavior that they can do happily and industriously and accept their lot and not interfere with the overall behavior of the society in which other people, more talented and more able, are doing the things that they can do. And so Plato does this, of course, through a structure of the society itself, but also a system of beliefs and myths that leads them to believe that that's their nature, and they better be happy with it, that's just.
Yes.
You're talking about something like the same thing.
To some extent, except that formula of teaching them myths and so on can so easily be misused, and it does suggest fascism and Brave New World and the alphas and betas and gammas.
Now, I didn't mean to suggest that we were talking about fascism.
No, but I know you didn't, and I'm not suggesting that Plato was a fascist.
No,
although many people have argued that, but I think there are other solutions to this.
All right.
And one of them that I've already suggested is that the kinds of things which the upper end of this curve engage in should be quite definitely moderate. As if you allow the brightest people to take an undue proportion of the goods of the world and to indulge themselves in all kinds of things, such as sports cars, for example, then there's going to be a great deal of trouble. I think
that's exactly what Plato said also.
Is it?
As the philosopher kings, they didn't get wealth, and they didn't get the goods of life, and didn't even get pleasures of family and that sort of thing.
No. Well, but what I am most concerned with, I really believe that the operant business is going to be extremely valuable in altering incentive conditions, and the incentive conditions which apply not only to workers but to management and entrepreneurs in general. But the primary thing that we're concerned with now is the quality of life. I think we've done nothing about the problem of leisure.
Dr. Skinner here examined in some detail how man might most profitably use his increasing amounts of leisure. His idea, he explained, is to reinforce people for participating in leisure activities that develop their own personalities more fully. Now Mr. Wheeler raises the question of how society can condition people to behave in a way that is constructive from an ecological point of view.
We have to devise reward systems that pay people for doing things that are sound from the standpoint of the overall cultural and ecological system rather than from the standpoint of individual gratification. What kinds of arrangements can we make in this way? Have you given much thought to that?
Well, I have given a lot of thought to it, not too successfully. If you look at this historically, how have cultures suddenly reversed themselves on affluence? I think the Puritan Revolution in England, where some government takes over against all of the excesses of restoration and so on, and drops the level of affluence in an enormous distance.
This doesn't seem to me to be a very good example, because the Puritan ethic was austere in one sense, but it was an ethic that also taught exploitation and depletion of resources.
Oh yes, well I know.
In a situation in which there was plenty of resources.
No, I don't mean the whole thing. I was thinking of the character in George Eliot's Adam Bede. She's an evangelist, a Methodist evangelist. And that was her great line. There's a Lord up in the manor and so on. He may think he's happy, but I know I'm happy here. And of course, the Christian promise of heaven helped out on that too. He's going to go to hell, but I've got my inner riches, and I'm going to have an eternity of blessedness. You can, within a given culture, suddenly reject the affluence and all that it implies. And I think that's what these hippies are doing today. That to hell with this. I can be happy in a with 4 or 5 other couples sharing a one-room apartment here. I don't care about all of this space. I don't care about these fine surroundings and so on. It's going to be happy.
Well, but you know the response that occurs there, and that is that this is a form of behavior that's only possible in a very wasteful, affluent society.
Right. Oh, yes, of course. It's not a solution.
So not really a solution.
No, and I don't think that the Methodist evangelist solution is going to work. What can be done? How does one go about making the more remote consequences of a cultural practice effective against the immediate gratifier?
It appears that mainland China is closest to operating along something like operant conditioning lines of anything that we know about. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't for a moment think they got it from Oxford research.
You're not responsible.
It'd be very difficult. I suppose
Revolution.
Someday someone will know enough about it to know how this does come about. But it is also, again, a little like that Methodist preacher in Adam Bede. This was a very strict and puritanical revolt against a very corrupt regime, where the important way to marshal forces on your side was to insist upon corruption and how awful it was and so on. I think probably the greatest social revolution in history is going on there.
In China?
Yes, I think so.
What makes you think it's so great?
Well, because I meant great only in the sense of magnitude. I don't know whether it's in the right direction or not. I suspect it is.
What makes you think it may be in the right direction?
Well, because
It looks like operant conditioning?
No, I think that
Well,
it shows a great deal. It shows a great deal of willingness to give up immediate gratifications for the sake of the future. For example, I understand it. They immediately got rid of all their pets, and no dogs or cats. Now, in America, there are nearly 40 million dogs and 35 million cats who are consuming some very high-quality food, if you can believe the ads that appear on television. How many people could live on that food in the world today if we just decided not to have cats or dogs around? Now, I'm not a cat lover or a dog lover. I know there are many people who are, and we regard this as a horrible suggestion. But I think a culture might very well seriously consider whether it can afford to have pets until it is actually feeding its people. And that's the kind of thing where the pleasure of having a dog around or the pleasure of having a cat and so on is one of those immediate kinds of things which I think need to be foregone if you are seriously taking the more remote consequences of a culture into account.
But beyond that, the ways in which the Chinese have managed to both get rid of a number of traditional folkways and cultural practices, such as the family system and the authority of the elders and so on, and at the same time introduce new practices that they deemed would be more productive for the society. The methods they've used appear to have been operant conditioning methods. That is, they appear to have used positive reinforcers rather than punitive measures.
Yes, I think that's true. Of course, there are the usual statements about how many million people have been murdered in the act of converting the country and so on. And of course, there's a good deal of informing on your neighbor and that kind of thing, so that you are always under some kind of big brother supervision. I talked with a woman recently who was there a number of years ago, and she was walking along the street, and she picked up a little bit of a ceramic, maybe probably a broken pot or something. That had a nice sheen, so he took it home. And shortly afterwards, a knock on the door of a hotel, and the police came in and said, "You have been reported as having confiscated property of the government." And some child had seen her do this, and the child had been taught that you were to report this kind of thing. Well, I can't believe that people are 100% under operant control when that kind of thing's going on.
Yeah.
Dr. Skinner ends the interview by describing some of his aspirations for man.
Look upon me as a person who is very much concerned for the future of his way of life because it's been made very important to him by his own education and so on. So, for some reason, I am very anxious to produce a better human condition than we now have. In my own culture, in the culture of the whole world, I would like individuals to spend much more of their time doing the things they want to do than the things they have to do. And I mean by that the things they are reinforced for rather by positive reinforcers rather than the things they're reinforced for by the escaping negative reinforcers or the threat of negative reinforcers. And I would want this to happen in such a way that they would be far more achieving than they are now, and in traditional terms would be given much more credit for what they do than would now be the case. I believe that a world in which this happens will be a world which is much freer of disruptive, time-consuming struggle against those who are coercing you and so on, and also a world in which the individual would develop to the point at which, if there is ever an emergency, he'd be most effective in solving problems and contributing the things needed to save the culture.
You have been listening to a conversation between B.F. Skinner, author of Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and Harvey Wheeler of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. This conversation was recorded during a conference held at the Center in Santa Barbara, where this program originated.